Welcome to NETINT's Voices in Video, where we explore critical streaming-related topics with the experts who create and implement new streaming media technologies. One issue that should be paramount to all participants in the streaming media ecosystem, producers, engineers, product and service providers, consumers, is power consumption. An organization called Greening of Streaming was recently created to address growing concerns about the energy impact of the streaming sector. Today, we're speaking with Dom Robinson, who is the founder of Greening of Streaming and Chief Business Development Officer of Ideas. Hi, Dom. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jan, how you doing?
I'm good. So some housekeeping notes. If you're watching and have a question, please post them as a comment on whatever platform you're watching, and we'll answer those live as time permits. If we don't get to them live, we'll get to them via email after the show. Okay, Dom, what's going on with you? How are you?
I'm good. I'm finally in my office, sat down for the first time in about 7 weeks, just doing normal day's work at my desk, which is good.
Listen, why don't you, you've been in the industry, probably as long as I have. Tell us about Greening of Streaming and how it was formed, when, who was involved, how did it all come about?
Sure. So you may remember for a while I was running the Content Delivery Summit for Streaming Media Magazine, and conversations in that group kind of started amongst the sort of network architects and CDN architects and sort of encoding cloud architects started up about their sustainability and so on, and that over a couple of years that sort of grew into its own event. And as I was standing up that event, I sort of thought, this is really big, let's maybe set up a trade association. And what was once a sideline conversation, the conference has now become a fairly fully fledged members association. We've got about 25, 30 members, growing monthly at the moment. And yeah, it's keeping me very busy, that is for sure. The main objectives of the organisation is to sort of foster collaboration across the industry, looking at energy efficiency principally and the result of how we deploy streaming architectures to address that energy efficiency.
What is the LESS Accord? I've heard that mentioned both by you and by some other people.
As the organisation sort of really got to the end of its first year, we were having some discussions about in the sidelines of IBC last year about what was good enough, what would a good enough streaming quality be. If you were to optimize around that good enough quality, could you actually get to economies of scale where you were being energy efficient as well? We originally called it a gold button model because we wanted to offer the idea to the consumer, instead of opting into green, was given green or given an energy efficient service, but could opt into a higher quality by pressing a gold button or some sort of interaction notionally. Apparently gold buttons don't translate to America very well. Apparently you get gold buttons for winning spelling bees. So we decided to rebrand it to the Low Energy Sustainable Streaming Accord, which has the catchy title LESS, and was sort of caught the imagination. So it's quite a mouthful to really explain what it's all about. But there are lots of silos of work across the industry looking at energy efficiency in sort of atomic scenarios of specific workflow processes. We're very concerned that we look at it systemically and that we're not just passing energy problems up and down the whole supply chain. And so the LESS Accord is an attempt to align everyone's thinking around specific areas of effort so that we can get all the best engineers to focus on the right problems and collectively and create some direction of travel for everyone together, rather than just lots of spidering and slightly random walks into the new innovation space of making streaming energy efficient.
Can you give us an example of what you might reduce to reduce energy? I mean, are you talking resolution? Are you talking bit rate? You talking? I mean, what do you reduce to save energy and reduce quality?
That is the billion-dollar question at the moment. That there are lots of assumptions that it's as simple as reducing bit rate. There's also a lot of conflation about what you mean when you reduce bit rate. Reducing bit rate for somebody doing encoding work means something different to reducing bit rate when you're transmitting data across a network. Not in terms of bit rate is bit rate, but in terms of the effect it has on your power environment. So it's not as simple as reducing bit rate. One of the big experiments that we've been carrying out in what we call Working Group 4 has been looking at whether we can actually correlate energy bumps in operators' platforms with traffic bumps. And so far we've found very little correlation at all, which it makes it complicated when everybody's immediately sort of talking about this correlation between gigabytes and carbon or gigabytes and kilowatts. It certainly isn't a linear relationship if there is a direct relationship at all in the transmission networks. And obviously your world, the encoding world, obviously if you're not encoding, you're not using power. If you're encoding, you're using power to some extent. And so there's definite volatility in encoding and decoding, and those ends we're paying particular attention to. But also we have hardware optimizations and strategies around how we use hardware resources on a sort of more macro scale that can make big differences as well. So we're exploring all those things at the moment.
Yeah, one of the presentations I think you saw at Mile High with me was from a different organization that was looking at power on TV power consumption. So how do you, I know that there's some standards organizations looking at power consumption. How are you going to work with them? How's that all going to shake out?
Yeah, so Grading and Streaming is expressly not a standards organization. There's lots of them. They're very good at what they do. We would be in their world considered a user group. So we do have a working group within Grading and Streaming specifically focusing on driving energy as a KPI into protocol and standards development. So by means of an example, the pioneering project we're trying there is with the SBTA. They have their open caching system, and within open caching, there's a routing or essentially a routing protocol called capacity insights. And what we're doing is we're exploring where we can find energy data sources, energy mix data sources, one of the places where we do talk about carbon, that we can feed into the decision-making tree. So, anecdotally, if you're in Iceland trying to decide which cache you're going to pull a piece of content from, whether it's London or New York, everything's equal in price of performance, but the New York cache is solar powered and the London one's fossil powered, then it might be interesting to weight the load and the demand onto that New York cache. Of course, at this stage, that's moot as to whether it would save any energy, but we might be able to determine its use by energy mix, the input into the system that's hosting those caches, or whatever it may be. There's lots of really interesting explorations like that going on.
So if you meet somebody on a plane or in an elevator or offhand, and they say, what are the top X things I can do right away to reduce my power consumption? And say they're a streaming video producer that goes all the way through. They've got their own encoding farm, they've got their own player, they broadcast around the world with CDNs. What are the top X things they can do to really make an impact as soon as possible?
I'd say explore rather than do. As Grading and Streaming, we're a long way from having best practice that we can recommend. There's so many divergent and complex strategies going on at the moment. It's very difficult to actually say this is the best thing to do, because there's just a lot of depends around any answer like that. But in simple terms, the obvious thing is turn stuff off that you don't need. That underpins a whole discussion about redundancy strategy. So if you're a live engineer, I'll give you an example. There isn't a lot of conversation between a cloud and what you might run on the cloud. Yes, if you use a SaaS service from the cloud, like their own sort of home-hosted encoding service, you might find things are different. But if you just simply use a vanilla cloud computer to run your own encoding process, the cloud host has no idea what you're doing. So if you then need to set up a second one for redundancy, well, that's sort of very traditional thing to do in a live streaming environment. What we found in talking to cloud hosts is they have no idea what the application is. So they see an engineer spin up a computer, they don't know what it is, but they want to offer 4 nines on that availability. So they spin up a hot spare. Then the engineer spins up a second transcoder, and the cloud goes, oh, I don't know what they're doing, but we'll give them a hot spare. So you've actually got 4 computers hot when you're only trying to run one workload, which might have an outage of a few seconds. So we have to think in, that's just a sort of very simplistic example of where we might be over provisioning redundancy. And think about SLA. SLA is, the networks themselves aren't that congested. They're just reserved so that people can hit SLAs. And so think about SLA. Think about whether you really need 9 nines availability for live streaming your kid's birthday party or something. There are certain degrees of over provisioning that have become natural because they're very commoditized and affordable. But they might be unnecessary, and there might be, you might be able to halve your energy footprint simply by not using half of your infrastructure. And that goes down into codecs as well. And there's going to be, and there is, an endless discussion about quality, whether we need 2K, 4K, 8K, 16K, and so on. And I think it's an interesting debate. There's not a great deal of clarity actually about what power those decisions make in terms of the distribution network. In terms of encoding, can be quite vanilla. You can completely immediately see if you do less bit rates, or if you do lower bit rates, or if you do higher compression even, and produce lower bit rates. Sometimes you might have a different energy profile, but that's probably only a small part of the picture. If you save 500 watts on your encoder, it may be that something you've done has put 5% more energy on all the decoders, and you've suddenly got 30 million viewers consuming another another God knows how many megawatts off the grid, for the sake of your half kilowatt saving at the core of the network. So it has to be really complete in the picture before we can really say do this. But those are the sort of areas that people should be exploring and understanding within their workflow.
Is there a simple answer to, does it take less energy to transmit lower bit rates versus higher bit rates, or do you have to look at the decode side again, as you just mentioned?
It's not a simple answer. It really isn't a simple answer. The network is not provisioned against bit rate. It's provisioned against expected peak capacity. So when you don't send data, you don't save any energy in the transmission network. So the bit rate doesn't matter to the telco or the CDN. The CDN caches are stuffed full. It's just how quickly you cycle things. That you don't, by not storing stuff in a CDN, you don't reduce your caches. But when it comes to the consumer device, you can set a flag in a codec which trips a decode on a laptop from GPU to CPU and see your fans go on just because something's changed. That might be bitrate. It might be you've switched HDR on. It might be you've changed your frame rate. It might be any number of factors that are just incompatible with the target device. So it's a minefield to come up with the best practice. And it's certainly a complex, there isn't really a do this. What I would say though is don't overproduce. Don't, if you produce 3,000 runs in a ladder, you're probably going a bit far, in my opinion. So
one of the things we talked about that was surprising to me in terms of your challenges was agreeing on measurable objectives. Can you go into that?
There is a macro picture of how much of a problem are we trying to address and how can we measure success in that. So that tends to have the headline grabbing figures that I'm very terse about using these days, but at a macro end, the IEA produced a figure that 1% of the global final electricity supply is currently being used by data centers, that 1.5% is being used by telco, and 6% of global final electricity supply is being used by ICT, but that ICT figure includes the telco and the data center energy consumption. So at a top level, we're probably, if streaming is 60–70% of the network, we're probably, and this is conjectural, we're probably using 2 to 3% of global final electricity supply. So in terms of measurable success for greening and streaming, if we could feel that, in 5 years time, 3 years time, we've changed that trajectory and we're looking at something more like 1.5% of global final electricity supply, we're probably doing the right thing. Especially if everyone's still entertained and getting a great experience. In terms of the sort of smaller, more microscopic measurable elements, I've touched on this correlation between gigabytes and carbon, and we're erring caution about making any direct correlation there. We are looking at different measurement techniques for the different, but basically it's a bit like sort of deep physics. It depends on perspective. If you measure a system that's used by many different shared services, you have to try to work out how you can report on any one of those services in terms of its energy. And the models vary extensively. We are tending to try to take global sort of top level systems energy, i.e. comparable to what your electricity supplier would be billing you, and look for fluctuations in that based on load. So that encompasses a lot of the baseline energy, which is really being burnt in order to make streaming possible. The problem comes when you want to really say, well, how much did my stream use through that system? And you have to apportion it. As soon as you set up an apportionment model, you get into deep complexity about when systems are being used and who by and what the other processes are and so on. And it becomes extremely difficult to come up with a clear-cut way to say how much energy any one particular stream is using. It might be a different exercise than one we're kicking around in one of our projects that's come out of the Lesser Accord, to explore what Will Law kindly nicknamed the breadcrumb model, where as a file passes through an encoder, you kind of put a meter in the file and you start the clock, reading the kilowatt hours as you start the encode, and you read it again at the end of the encode. And even if there's other encoding processes going on, that is the energy that's being used in creating that file. You record that increment of kilowatt hours. As it moves into storage, you repeat the process and add it. And so by the time the file gets to its destination, you've got a sort of cumulative clock of how much energy has actually been consumed by the computers that have got that file to you. The problem is, if you have two files that come in parallel through that workflow, they're going to accumulate the energy twice. So it's going to give a very skewed picture of what we think the energy going into the system is. So perspective is complicated, and it means that there's no one simple answer.
Yeah, one of the things that you've spoken about here, and we spoke about in our meeting, was the whole measuring the systemic load. Can you load that image that you had? Yeah. And I'm not sure how well it's going to show up in the Zoom, but I think you've been talking about how challenging it is, and I think that was a great illustration of exactly what you're talking about. So why don't you assume that people can see the outline, but not the detail, and just take 2 minutes and walk through this.
I think I can zoom in a little bit like that as well. So yeah, so basically, when once we'd formed the group and we were having our first meetings to talk about what the group wanted to form as working groups, I'd been reading a lot of the science which was trying to relate streaming to climate science. And one of the things that stood out is I didn't feel people had a complete picture of what was going on. And so the first thing I thought was useful was to do an exercise where I redrew a live stream, as I've looked after for 30 years now, from the perspective of every box that might go wrong, that might break the link, i.e. if I didn't have an internet, what boxes would I need to plug in to recreate a single point-to-point live stream? So that's what this diagram sort of seeks to represent. So, and it also separates it into things like network layers. People talk about layer 3 and layer 4. This is kind of the network layer view. I've also sort of sectioned it as we go along, so you can look at where people are talking about contribution feeds or access loops or whatever. Some of the terminology is matched against those different stages of the network as we go right through. So following from the top left, where we've got usually 2 encoders, I drew 2 to emphasize that it's usually a dual path. you're feeding into typically maybe straight into some sort of system. Sometimes you're feeding into some sort of local digital asset management process, into switches, out of your router into your first mile, if you like, up to your local exchange. You might go through some authentication up in layer 4, and then you go all the way up into the core exchange, where you might encounter something. I drew this box on because I think it's probably best explained if you think of a point of aggregation like maybe YouTube Live's hub or a point of origin. You know, notionally that's a point of origin, and then that feeds into your CDN. Obviously, that would normally be a big cloud. But in order to stream in and out of CDN, potentially you might be able to hit the local edge and bounce back out of just one box. So keeping things to a minimum, the network carries on. You might have your exchange caching. You might even have some much deeper caching in the system. And then if I just move the video window right over on the right-hand side, you're into the access loop. Now, it's funny, a lot of people who are involved in greening and streaming and beyond, I don't think they'd seen it really drawn out as a physical map before and thought about it in those terms. That's what it looks like behind the code when it all gets delivered, and that gives some idea of the amount of kit that's actually getting the stream from A to B when you actually include layer 2 in the internet, the physical layer underneath the internet. The things that I think, one of the things that's really important about this diagram is on the right hand side, that last mile router and the set-top box highlighted in orange, the kind of the thing that's going to do the donkey work of decoding in the facility or in the home. That orange box goes on and off. You know, it's probably on, if it's a domestic box, maybe 4 hours a day or something. But everything else pretty much, maybe the display goes off, but everything else pretty much stays on 24/7. So if you start to look at the energy involved, everything else is you know, you're taking the integral over time, so it's on a lot of the time relative to the set-top box. The set-top box is probably computationally doing more work than anything in the network, apart from maybe if there's some transcoding going on in some of these early stages, but that's not really what we were trying to represent in this. It's more of a true internet end-to-end model here. So really, the compute cycles are going on in the encoder and the decoder, but everything else is on, and also everything else is on and quite scaled up. So, for example, here where I am, outside my home, the first amplifier at the top of the telegraph pole, which splits my my copper line from me and my neighbours, that's running 400 watts, and then the first cabinet's running a kilowatt at least, depending on how many ports they put in it. So you start to rack up quite a lot of energy in that infrastructure, although it's shared, I take the point, but in terms of proportionality for a single user, really the weight of the energy is off on the left here into the core of the network.
So you've described this, you know, I'll call it a big elephant. I mean, how do you take a first bite? How do you approach it to start making progress?
You know, again, returning back to the lesser chord, in fact, if I'm going to share something again, if it's all right, because I think this is the right time to talk about it. So after talking to a you know, really broad cross section of the industry's engineers about what their intuition is about where they think the energy savings might be, one of the key ones is summarized there as our intelligent distribution model shifting. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but we have these camps of unicast and multicast. So networks are using their energy for their in capacity, and the capacity is provisioned to cater for their largest peaks. So anything that can help mitigate those peaks is useful, and those peaks are almost invariably big live, typically football games or sports events. They're the really big, hard-hitting impacts that networks really get paid a lot of money to guarantee delivery of, and they really provision themselves so that they can handle it. But there's these models like multicast and even peer-to-peer, which appear every now and then and purport to be able to scale live streaming much more efficiently. Now, efficiency is a big moot word. Efficiency in data, efficiency in economics, and efficiency in energy are three related but not connected things. So simply saying anyone's efficient over another is a complicated thing. What we're going to set about doing is one of our key lessical projects over the next 6 to 12 months is getting some energy measurements of as close to possible, some apples to apples comparisons between those different models at different scales, to try to provide a bit of information which operators haven't yet had, which is when to choose to use those different models. Because honestly, deploying a little bit of compute to everybody's home router or in every DSL exchange or wherever the fan out points are, in order to enable stuff like application layer multicasting or peer-to-peer or whatever it may be, those will increment the energy used in all those relay points. And if you're doing that across your whole network, because you might have 30 people watching a stream, then it's clearly not as energy efficient as sitting with something that might be ostensibly less energy efficient, like brute force unicasting. However, once you get up into the hundreds of thousands and millions, it's much more complicated. You have to look at the regions, you have to look at the network access. Critically, you have to understand the devices and so on. So that's a big area of research to look into, which are the big scaling models that can, or what are the energy decisions around when you use those big scaling models. So I think that's a big area of interest. Codecs and compression and network optimization is obviously ongoing. It's a big part of it. It's a big school of discipline within the streaming industry, and rightly so. It's where we use a lot of energy in encoding farms, which I know you know about at NETINT, and we use a lot of energy in decoding in the set-top box and the TV environment. That's much more complicated in the bring your own device era, but it's still an area we need to get much deeper understanding of. Most of the work on set-top boxes to date has been done under lab conditions. There's very little which has been done particularly in the bring your own device environment in anything like a real user measurement environment. So there's a lot of research to be done in that space. Measurement itself, I've mentioned the breadcrumb model, is another key area that we really need to come to a little bit more consensus over. However, I think part of the reason there isn't much consensus is because there hasn't been that much practical experimentation in the networks. Everyone's waiting for an academic decision that they can implement, but the academics don't have enough data from industry yet to really have those ideas refined. So we need to close that loop, and measurement is really the central conversation in that discussion. And then finally, the hardware and infrastructure optimization. Atomically, we can do quite a lot easily in lab conditions. We can measure things, but cool things like immersion cooling and fundamentally changing how we design our build out of data centers and storage requirements, and what expectations we have and how those affect those architectural decisions at scale. There's still quite a lot of discussion to be had there. There's some fun projects in that space as well. That's big iron stuff. That's where we get to play with the telcos. So those, okay, I think, are the hotspots. Those are really the hotspots that we're really focusing on. I think there are other hotspots, and every sector, every standards body has its own domain where they're the experts. What we're hoping is we can wave in our flags and say, hey folks, latency is pretty boring now. There's loads of other innovation around energy to do, and get the engineers to start focusing on doing exactly what they're doing today with exactly the same latency, but doing it with half the energy. That's a great area to start.
One of the discussions that kind of got hot on LinkedIn maybe 18 months ago was VVC versus H.264, and were the advanced codecs that required so much more energy to encode gonna put, was it going to increase power or decrease power because of the reduced bit rates that they were delivering? And do you have any, I know it's challenging looking at the the entire ecosystem, but what are your off the cuff thoughts about the more advanced codecs that are much more difficult to encode and probably decode?
I think the one thing that really stands out for me about codec deployment is rolling out, churning out kits to support something new is probably takes many years of win in terms of an operational performance to replace. If everybody goes, well, I'm going to have AV4, so I'm going to bin my laptop, I'm going to bin everything that runs AV1 because it doesn't run AV4 and churn it all out, and my stuff doesn't get recycled properly and ends up in endless landfills or just, you know, being inefficient somewhere else. That has to be part of the equation. So it's never as simple as this is more in a 5% more energy efficient codec. You know, there is a strong argument that H.264 is probably so ubiquitous and does the job good, you know, sufficiently well enough that do we need anything more? And are we actually focusing on the wrong problems? You know, we are being challenging and purposefully wanting to ruffle some feathers. Is the return on investment into codecs really worth it when we could be investing in energy efficiency?
I'm reminded of looking at buying an electric car and someone saying the best thing you can do to save electricity is to keep using your own car and not buy a new one. You know,
correct. One of the biggest, you know, we could sidetrack into that, but you know, buying a 2.5-ton SUV electric hasn't really saved the problem. You've probably used half the planet in building the car itself. So we have to think about those embedded emissions. Although Green Stream doesn't talk about carbon, we have hardware vendors and hard chip manufacturers and tin, you know, infrastructure providers in all our working groups, and they're constantly sitting there thinking about the physical resource, because it's a very complicated argument as well. And one of the most subtle ones is actually driving. There is an argument that driving more bandwidth onto the networks drives innovation, and at different stages of innovation, we can get exponentially more efficient with real terms reductions in power. So, and this, you can see it in fiber networks at the moment. As you go from one generation of fiber to another, you're quite often getting a 100-fold increase in capacity, and in real terms, a 0.75 reduction in power. So the question becomes, how quickly can you migrate everyone off the old stuff and recycle the old tin? Whereas, which means you need traffic to drive the economy to invest in that churn, and you'll actually reduce the energy, even though the capacity will go up. It's not following Jevons paradox in its simplest way. Normally, like 4G to 5G, we've actually had a real terms increase in power of about 4-fold, and no traffic's moved into the 5G network. So we've got a potentially more efficient network, but there's nothing going on. So the efficiency's not really valid until we're at you know, basically 100% utilization, or at least comparable utilization to the previous network, at which point, you know, today we're just investing more power and not really getting any gains. So yeah, I think those innovation cycles themselves are not non-simplistic, and churning codecs. Yeah, if you can massively reduce the power in your data center, that's probably a good thing. But if your data center is consuming 30 megawatts, but you've just put 150 megawatts on everyone's decoding because of all those little set-top boxes working that much harder or having to be binned and replaced, you know, you've got to think hard about that.
One of the things we talked about in our planning meeting was a player control that a consumer would have that would increase the quality at an increased cost. Could you go into that? Is that something that's soon to be appearing, is appearing now, is kind of on the long-term roadmap?
Yeah, so I think that's referring really to the gold button idea that we were talking about. So this is the idea that it's probably worth sort of going a little bit more specific into the human side of that. Last summer, when we did our sort of public launch over here, we did a survey around that to find out how much the consumer was aware that streaming used energy, and in that awareness, whether they felt empowered to act or to do anything about it. we looked at whether eco mode, green button, those sort of opt-in services had any uptake, and really they don't. When people get eco mode, their TV's shipped in eco mode, and it's the first thing they do is turn it off and put the brightness up. And they just bought this high performance TV. They don't want a dull, crippled picture in the name of eco. It's just not the way it is. And there was a clear sense that the industry had to take leadership here, take responsibility in many ways, and put a menu of energy efficient options in front of the consumer. So rather than having a green button, which you opted into if you're environmentally sort of socially responsible, the idea was we ship you a green stream, and because we're the internet, we don't have to take away consumer choice. So all the people who go, panic, consumer choice has been infringed. Well, it hasn't. We've given you a fat, great big orange button, or a switch, or some sort of interaction of any sort you want, which basically allows you to upscale or upgrade or boost your signal for the duration of the match or the duration of the box set viewing or evening's viewing, because you're sitting there getting value from it. And while I want to save energy, I'm also a human. When I want a coffee, I boil a kettle. But what I don't do is I don't leave my kettle boiling all day just in case I want a coffee. That doesn't have efficiency risk. And what we are doing in real terms with a lot of broadcast and streaming technology strategies is we push everyone up to the highest possible rung on the ladder. So my boy is dribbling on the carpet watching Peppa Pig at UHD for, if that's got an 8-fold increase in traffic and energy impacts and who knows what, do have to stop at some point and say, do we need to be by default offering my boy Peppa Pig in UHD? I'm sure he'll put up with it in 2K. And so I think it's sort of not an existential argument, but it's a directional argument that we have to ask ourselves. As a whole, when we're over engineering, why don't we divert that resource to doing, either more energy efficiency or just brutally better engineering anyway? So I think those are the key questions, and that's really what the gold button idea.
What's upcoming? What are the milestones you see hitting in terms of meeting and formulating and announcing and releasing specifications and best practices?
So after pretty much 7 weeks on the road as of today, I'm chilling out, writing a couple of papers, and then having a little bit of a break in August because it has been immensely full on the last few months actually. What I'm hoping to do though, by writing those papers, is get them out to project leads. We're trying to isolate project leads for those 4 projects that I showed you a minute ago. We've got basically volunteers for all of them. Then to go through those papers and just agree the project scope and project plan. And hopefully those project leads will engage with the members and some guests, because we've got gaps in our membership, some guests who are going to help fill the gaps, and so that we can stand those projects up. And so what we hope to do is come to IBC this autumn, and fingers crossed IBC are going to fit us into the program somewhere so that we can stand up and say, right, these are the 4 projects, this is what we're testing, and this is how we're going to go about testing those. As a little bit of an opportunity again for the industry to say you've missed something, or we think this, just keep that feedback coming in. Transparency is important here. And then in providing that we feel that we're onto the right thing, then through October, I hope the projects will sort of start to form, the technical work will start to sort of frame itself out. And then the aspiration is in Q4 and Q1, when the streaming is sort of busiest in Northern Europe and America, we're going to get some real testing underway. And that should bring data into our academic sort of community's hands. I would have thought by the beginning of Q2, but by the end of Q2, if we are lucky, we might be able to actually give some guidance in a model scenario, but the core system will be as near to production as possible. What will be modeled still at that point will be the client devices. They will all be going into test facilities because it's going to be too complicated if we do everything in one go. But as we finish that project, we should have finalised the planning for some research grants, which we're looking to collaborate on, which will then hopefully take the whole project to the next stage over the following year and go into an exploration of what's really going on in the consumer premises equipment environment. So the player, the set-top box and the TV, the media player, the laptop, smartphone, all of those, we want to go from lab to real world measurement model over sort of from summer next year forward, so that we can take our core models that we've hopefully settled on and test them in real user environments and actually check that by the time we bring this into a sort of, you know, OTT, bring your own device world, that those attempts to bring down the energy of our systems actually really work in the wild. So it's sort of a bit of a 2-year plan, but it's also changing and full on a day-by-day basis, email by email. It's quite intense at the moment. So that's the plan from Greening and Streaming's point of view.
Tell us who's in Greening of Streaming now and where to go to, what it costs to join, I guess, and where to get more information.
So these are our current members. So there's sort of a couple of different groupings in there. The top 2 rows are our founder members. They came in on day 1, and then scattered. Well, it's in order that they joined basically, and then scattered amongst the members that are thereafter, a few public service broadcasters who can join and get involved for free as long as they're participants. And then likewise, more recently, we've extended that to affiliations with other peer industry groups like the Digital Television Group and IABM, and there's a few others coming in as well. So we just swap one secretariat membership so that we can keep an ear to the ground on what we're all doing and make sure that there's good collaboration between the organisations. So it depends on turnover. We don't really means test, but I think it's sort of people just play the honest card. So over 10 million turnover, it's £12,000 UK a year, and it drops down to under £1 million turnover, which is about £2,000 a year. So we are, by our own admission, not a cheap organisation to join, and that was by design. We did not want to become a green badge which people could buy and be non-participatory and tick the box and say, I've done the greening and streaming thing, I'm now green. We have a fundamental rule in the organisation of no greenwashing, and that applies to membership as well. Or specifically, we want organisations to stop and think before they get involved and get some groundswell of support from across the organisation. So of the sort of 25 organisations we got involved, there's about 130 signed up and active on the hub people. And then in the background as well, it's always worth mentioning that I have about a dozen volunteer secretariat. So we don't have an individual member class, but there are some really good consultants and experts who are really well connected across the industry or have, you know, retired from leading jobs in the sector, who help me on a day-to-day basis with lots of the admin, lots of the sort of group leadership and you know, setting up meetings and those sort of things. And they're invaluable. And so for people who are exceptionally keen to get involved and bring a lot of network, bring a lot of skill, expertise running all these sort of organisations, because I sure as hell am making it up as I go. Then I do welcome people interested in getting involved in the secretariat, but I do ask you to do stuff for it. So yeah, that's sort of the big picture at the moment.
I guess on a personal note, how are you? You know, Ideas is launching their first product or their first major product, North. Now, how are you balancing? I mean, you're the chief. What are you? Chief product officer? Chief
biz dev officer. So Greening and Streaming has definitely taken over my time. I thought for the first year of running it that I could run it arm's length and hire a friend who was a management consultant to run it. And he did a really good job, but he didn't know the sector. And so there was so much referral back to me that we had to make a bit of a decision last year. And part of my role with Ideas used to be our marketing. And we used to take a bit of a black ops sort of special ops approach to finding really specialized big scaled up live streaming platforms in the fintech and sports arena to help. You know, that was cool that they came in, but that had a lot of professional services on it, and we wanted to really scale up the core licensable technology and ideas, which is what's Norsk. So we've slightly repositioned the business, and I'm a good guerrilla marketing guy. I'm not necessarily a brand marketing guy, and we thought Eric, who obviously you know well, was the man for that. He's seen every pitch under the sun and would probably guide us well out of the darkness. And he's doing a great job in helping us brand Norsk. And at the moment, a lot of the effort is on raising that awareness on the marketing side of it. At the end of the day, I wear an ideas t-shirt because I'm, you know, that's part of my day job, and everyone knows that. Ideas is a member just as much as the other contributors to Greening and Streaming and members. I happen to wear the hat of running it at the moment because we've kicked it off, and that's the way the cookies crumbled at the moment. But you know, it is a members-led organisation, and we will be looking to sort of make sure that I'm not dictator in chief and not letting anyone else have a go in due course. So I fully expect to return to ideas over time, but at the moment, you know, Greening and Streaming, I have the capacity 4 days a week to be doing Greening and Streaming and keep my eye on the biz dev as we're starting to build out our new product set. It is full on. It is very, very, I really thought Greening and Streaming was going to be a sideline conversation. I had no idea it would be 2 full-time jobs in one. And I think it's just of the moment and a bit of serendipity, which is good. So.
Okay, question coming in. Not seeing a lot of telcos on the membership slide.
No, we're weak on. Yeah, we're definitely weak on telco operators. We'd love more, and you know, we've got access to broadcasters through the EBE. DAZN are a bit of a flagship content provider amongst our midst, and a lot of our testing is we're turning to them to source. But yeah, we definitely want more engagement from telco operator, and we got a good relationship with content where we need it, but we are always interested in talking to content providers from the top line down.
Question: what are the challenges of an organization that can issue recommendations only but not enforce them? So I guess how are you're gonna come up with a bunch of recommendations. What happens then?
So I think in practice, you can't really enforce technical standards anyway. So I don't even think of the standards body as being enforcers. Maybe they protect patents and stop people stop people deploying things. But I've never really thought you can force standards down people's throat unless you're sort of Apple and you decide HLS is the way of the world and so on. You know. By engaging the big oil tankers like Akamai, Intel, AMD, you know, there's loads of them among that group, and by engaging more and more of them, I think we can change the culture of the industry. And they used to call it in public affairs terms, they used to call it self-regulation. That term tends to be favoured more by, or the term industry-led reform tends to actually be more favoured, and Greening and Streaming definitely wants to lead the engineers to think in a better way. I don't think they need to be told what to do. Most engineers I know are intelligent and they love a problem. Even if they're nutcase climate deniers, in practical terms, they also like making profits. So we sit on the fence with that in practical terms. If you're all about lowering your bottom line by reducing energy, then fine, Greening and Streaming is for you. If you're all about saving the environment by reducing energy, then fine, Greening and Streaming is for you. Doesn't really matter. We can't force it on anyone, but what we can do is make the culture of the industry sit there and go, do you know what? That's really energy inefficient. I'm not going to tell the boss we can do that. And that sort of direct action from the engineering floor will change things very directly.
Certainly, it's a worthwhile cause. You know, couldn't have a better leader for at least the initiation phase of it. And
yeah, I'm sure everyone will get tired of me soon. I'm sure.
I appreciate you taking time out of your busy dual.
No, not at all. This is my busy job, so this is a pleasure.
Okay, cool. Good to see you again, and you know, we'll be talking, I'm sure, in the near term.
Speak soon.